Buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. That doesn't happen usually in the European Union. If we speak so early in the morning, nobody answers when I say good morning. And that's why we like spending time with representatives from Latin America. Many thanks for coming along to this panel, to this event today. It's an unusual event. Our objective is to do something different. And afterwards, we will find out whether we've succeeded or not. Why different? Well, we're not only launching the report Latin America Outlook 2019, which I have to tell you has caused all of us a few sleepless nights, Alicia, Mario, all of us. No, this event also gives us the opportunity to have a dialogue on the role of cooperation in the framework of the agenda of development in transition. We would like to understand what this new concept should really mean in an ever-changing world. We have a long relationship with our partners in Latin America. And in that context, we want to listen, not to long speeches, please. No, what we want are genuine reference voices. We want to be provoked. We want to be inspired. We want to learn to think. We want to innovate. We want to start a new era of cooperation between the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean. We want to hear about your personal experiences and about your intellectual leadership, please. So these reference voices are here today. And this is, by the way, the first time that I've had the opportunity to speak before my Director General. Sorry about that, Stefano. But in the centre, we have my director, the director of my service, who leads and manages a lot of money and a lot of people, Stefano Manservisi. We have Alicia Bassana, who is a real friend and has been a friend to me ever since I took up my post in DevCo. And she has been very successful over the last few years. Obviously, we have a very close friend from Latin America who is, and a friend of Latin America too, Mario Pezzini. The three of us have been responsible for producing this new report. And we'd like to listen to them share their passion with us today. Stefano, over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yolita, Vice President, President of the Economic and Social Committee of the European Union, Alicia, Maria, Mario, cooperation agencies and friends. I've been told not to make a speech, so I'll try not to abuse this opportunity that I have today and try to share the genuine passion that I have for the relationship between Latin America and the European Union with you. This is not just a strategic partnership, it's a partnership based on strong emotion. And we do need to work together in this framework. It's a twofold honour to do that. We'd like to reflect today on the role that international cooperation can and should play in development in transition, particularly bearing in mind the current situation. I think 2 years ago, some of you were here when we launched this new initiative, and our focus was on graduation. So people said, well, we need to talk about this more. But I've worked with a lot of people and a lot of friends, and we've realized that that's not the way to work. There's a strategic reason for that, but also there are some global challenges that we're facing. And it's also because the genuine philosophy that we all share is an international philosophy, a philosophy of international cooperation. And we therefore need to have a focus on unfairness or inequality this year at the EDD. We've all agreed that the particular focus on inequality is something that unites Latin America and the European Union in this very complex world in which there is wealth, but wealth isn't properly distributed. There is growth, but growth isn't sustainable, in which there's a role for distribution of resources, but we also need a strategic relationship. And so, if there's another reason to do more together and to build our strategic relationship in the field of communication, for example, we've recently adopted a communication on our relationship with Latin America, and so that is even more important. So inequality and building, strengthening social cohesion. We are seeing the vulnerability of small countries in Latin America. And we're seeing the problems suffered by Costa Rica and Panama. We're seeing that we need economic diversification and environmental sustainability. Today, what I'd like to do is stress the potential for addressing universal challenges from a region with strengthened capacities, a region which is at peace, where poverty has reduced considerably, with consolidated democratic systems, and which has possibly the best trained generation in its history. But it's also a moment in which the association between the partnership between the two continents is more important than ever. And let me give you a number of examples. More than 6 million people have built their home on both sides of the Atlantic and contribute decisively to the development of our societies. The EU is the origin of 40% of foreign direct investment into Latin America, and the EU is where 1/3 of students from the region wishing to study abroad head for their university studies. The European Union is a reference. It's a model for public policies. That's what it says here. It's a reference for public policies for social cohesion and political and economic integration. And I say that because we see that one of the challenges that we have to confront together is precisely that the fact that inequality is starting to emerge in European society too, but we do have antibodies too. We have a situation in which the very existence of the European Union is the most important antibody that we have. It's the basis for solidarity and integration, which has enabled us to start combating these global phenomena that we're experiencing today. And it's in this way that we have a shared experience. So I think precisely that the links between Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean can lay the foundations for more ambitious association and cooperation models. We can do this by exchanging experiences. Turning now to the Agenda 2030 and the European Consensus on Development, all of us know that this is a paradigm shift in our approach to development. It's a paradigm shift in the making. It's an objective which we have to build together. We've moved from one blueprint to another blueprint. This is a commitment at the moment. It's a commitment to change, and we can only do that together. Our intention is to create a multidimensional agenda which calls for innovation and the commitment of all to offer responses to every development reality and global challenges. In that consensus, the European Union and its member states have made a commitment under Agenda 2030. We want to be a global society, including Latin America, and despite the differences between the different countries and between the two regions. This is an agenda for greater commitment. And to implement that agenda and that commitment, we need a flexible, ambitious and innovative association framework with all of our partners. This is what we want to achieve. We want to do even more. We want to go beyond what we're doing today. And I think within that framework, at the beginning, you can see that our reflections on this are contained in the recently published communication, where you can, and this gives you an idea of how we intend to work. So what does association mean? Association means a horizontal, bi-regional and bi-directional relationship based on political agendas built together, based on the value that both parties can contribute. We need to build and support development agendas. We talk about having shared agendas and triangular cooperation structures, as well as multilateralism. Association means having flexible collaboration frameworks in which the political dialogue covers the whole range of instruments. The agenda of transition, of development in transition, means moving away from the logic based on instruments and putting policies and common interests in their correct place. The instruments should be at their service. Our proposal to simplify and bring together all of our different international cooperation instruments, we've called it INDICI, it's a bad name, but it means that, we always have to, we're always under pressure to invent new names. It's always difficult, but INDICA, that's what it is. And on the basis of that, we'll be able to put in place actions and funding. Association also means establishing structures and cooperation instruments which are innovative, flexible and adaptable, capable of providing specific responses to the multiple development realities and building on the strengthened capacities of both partners. We talk about dialogue, exchange, networks, sub-regional approaches and blending. Association means that Mexico and the European Union, for example, are cooperating on designing an early warning mechanism for gender violence. That's become a global reference. And I was there when the Spotlight initiative was launched in the presence of the President of Mexico. Association means that, for example, Dora Quesada Montenegro, an entrepreneur, female entrepreneur from Costa Rica, supported by a network of 22,600 SMEs in Europe and Latin America, now exports her coffee candies and has been included as part of her country's brand, Costa Rica Esencial. And this means that something small has been transformed into something global. We've got an awful lot in common, because the backbone of the European economy are the SMEs, and we're able to share that model as well. Association means that the citizens of Ibagué are the first to be able to have a public system of pedal assist bicycles based on the consolidated experience of European cities. It's exchange. That's what exchange is. And this is the basis of the agenda of development in transition and the facilitating role which the Latin America Outlook 2019 identifies as essential for international cooperation. And perhaps I could just say a word on the Outlook, because it's an integral part of our strategy. It's not that we have policy and then implementation. We actually look at all of this together. We need a good analysis to be able to work out what's going on and look at the specific results of that. It's a huge amount of work, but we've done that together with the OECD, ECLAC, and many other partners. Cooperation between the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean needs to provide a basis for exploring new, more ambitious association structures. Our challenge is creating a distinct form of cooperation which can serve as a reference for international cooperation structures, and that's our launching pad. With Latin America, the European Union has been capable of establishing cooperation frameworks based on exchange and dialogue, and that has been capable of generating common answers to specific realities and global challenges. Just to give you a number of examples, Eurosocial has a bi-regional dialogue structure and structure for technical assistance, which forms the basis for designing public policies designed to strengthen social cohesion. And that's precisely one of the objectives of development in transition. And it's part of the discussion that we're all having today on inequality. Euroclima brings together more than 200 public and private organisations in local and regional initiatives to find responses to climate change. The Pacto builds on the basis of a link between development and security, has coordination through a network of more than 70 public institutions, bringing together police forces, judicial systems and prisons. Or another example is Al Invest, which provides a response to the challenge of low competitiveness through exchange and support to a network of 22,600 European and Latin American SMEs. Today, the challenge we're facing is to strengthen in triangular cooperation structures in the region so that we're capable of consolidating horizontal cooperation networks and supporting our partners as they work throughout the world. At the same time, based on the success of our regional blending facility, LIFE, it's possible to offer other opportunities with access to the European Investment Fund and closer work with the European Investment Bank. The European Union has invested heavily in this new paradigm for its work through the multi-annual framework 2021-2027. In conclusion, development in transition and the new role of international cooperation is not a theoretical discussion. It has to be a discussion in terms of implementation and how we can all make this potential a reality. Do we have all the answers? No. But we are counting on our partners in Latin America and the Caribbean to help us to. And let me just add a parenthesis here. We're working in the post-Cotonou environment, working with our partners in the ACP. We're building a common house, but we have a Caribbean pillar within that ACP house, and that Caribbean pillar is open to the Caribbean and Latin America. The idea is to unite our forces so that we can be more incisive and more successful and stronger. So that's the framework in which we are co-creating a new agenda, a new reality, and generating new paths. Every change and exploration requires courage and conviction. And we also have to be prepared to take criticism. And criticism is important. Otherwise, we'll just carry on as we're doing. So it's a path. It's a path of compromise, and it's a commitment on the part of the EU to open up new spaces. And I'd like to cite a major poet, Antonio Machado, who said, "Wayfarer, there is no path. You make your path by walking."
Thank you very much, Stefano.
Alicia Bárcena,
Executive Secretary of ECLAC. You have the floor.
Muy buenos días.
I'd like to wish everybody a very good morning. Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, Yolita, Mario, Luca. I think that this is a very important panel discussion. It's a great pleasure for me to be here amongst so many excellent colleagues and friends because it gives us an opportunity to think about the challenges of development and the future of international cooperation because, well, here we have friends of cooperation who are going to be on the next panel discussion. And we'll hear about what happens to countries graduating upwards through development. That's the problem. We've got Uruguay, we've got Antigua and Barbuda and Chile, and all of those are graduating. What happens afterwards? They continue to have structural gaps and vulnerabilities undermining their development. They're no longer necessarily in the cooperation association they were, but haven't reached another one. And so what do we do with those countries? How can we set up a new international cooperation system that leaves nobody behind, especially when multilateralism is so weak that the last thing we need is fragmentation? And when we have all these categories, less developed, middle income, are those the only important countries? No. Everybody is necessary. Everybody is vital. So how can we facilitate international inclusion following a new approach? And I think that transiting to a higher income level is a good thing. Nobody says that it's bad news moving from the category of low income, less developed countries. The problem is what happens next, because GDP per capita doesn't necessarily indicate how developed a country is. And GDP per capita is just an average. And that means that it can hide vulnerabilities and the traps whereby countries may move backwards. And I think that the Caribbean and Latin America are a good area of the world for us to be able to explore new possibilities with Europe. Why with Europe? Well, there are 4 reasons why I think Latin America and the Caribbean is a perfect area of the world where Europe can actually get resonance on such innovative ideas as I've just outlined, because this is innovative, moving away from the old traditions of LDCs and ODA. And that was fine. Nobody's criticizing it, but that's a complementary measure. It doesn't replace other possibilities. Now, we share cultural values with Latin America and the Caribbean. We say this on many occasions, but it's true. Latin America is the area that we probably have the most shared history and values with. And then there's a history of investment as well, as Stefano said quite rightly. In Europe, in Latin America, there's a great deal of investment stock, which could be lost because China is moving very quickly and buying up much of this investment stock. But the whole question of European investment is that it's quality investment. It's investment that brings technology in its wake, that brings jobs, that brings principles and regulations and standards. It's not just a question of how much money is invested, how many minerals are extracted. It's also the fact that this is based on a shared culture. Then also, we share the same vision of multilateralism. We know it's very important, particularly at such critical times as those that the world is going through today. We want stability for the climate. Obviously, Latin America is responsible for 8% of carbon emissions, but climate change and climate stability is vital if we're going to be able to make progress in the direction that we want to move in. And we're doing that together with Euroclimate, for example. We're well aware of what Latin America is doing with the national contributions, for example, and the European Union is very committed to that tool. And then another reason, Latin America and the Caribbean's aspirations of building a system based on well-being and based on
and
a welfare state is something that all of us share. All of us have the same vision of equality. Equality based not just on ethical and political reasons, based on rights, but also because inequality, or better, or lack of equality, it's inefficient, and it just shores up privileges. And so change is vital. So I would say that what we need to achieve, basically, is to understand what kind of gaps we're trying to overcome in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Europe has similar challenges in this area. But in this case, we do have problems in terms of access to capital markets, savings, investment, low tax levels in some areas, high levels of inequality. In Central America, the three countries in the north of Central America, inequalities are so gigantic that the 10% that are richer earn 70 times more than the 10% that earn the least. And the GDP per capita, as a result, doesn't actually reflect the scale of this problem, which evens out as an average. So Chile has made a great deal of progress, but many times a lot of the households that become so-called middle class do so because they enter into debt. It's not because of their savings and investments. It's not true that those households are in a stable situation. Yes, they get more income, but thanks to consumption credit. And many of them are still living and working in very precarious jobs. I think there are four main traps facing Latin America and Caribbean. Low productivity first. For 20 years, productivity has stagnated in Latin America and Caribbean. And really, that is a tragic state. No progress has been made on that front. Productivity is 20% of the US's productivity, 40% of the EU's. Nothing, in other words. And then we're also very vulnerable in social terms because of the high levels of inequality. There's a lack of confidence in the institutions that's persistent. There's a problem of morale in the system. And 46% of Latin Americans say that they have no confidence whatsoever in their governments. 64%, imagine. And then another problem is the fact that there's very little support for environmental sustainability or decarbonization. We've got two countries that have said they will be decarbonized by 2030. 2030, 2050. Chile and Costa Rica. But 2050, what's happening in the rest of the world? Australia says it's unlikely to reach that target. So what have we done with the centre, with Mr. Pezzini, with Stefano, with Yolita? We have entered this adventure together, this major challenge, rethinking development, rethinking cooperation. And so we had problems. What were we going to call it? We decided we'd call it Development in Transition, DIT. Why? Because we weren't really either talking about chalk or cheese here. It was difficult to decide what to call it. We weren't really developed countries nor developing countries, neither chalk nor cheese. So we had to come up with something whereby we could change the narrative. And that is why we have called this Development in Transition, a new narrative, a narrative that makes us possible one way or another to move forward. We've got various countries, Colombia, Uruguay, Chile, who are going to be telling us what they're experiencing. But we're countries that can also offer cooperation as well as receiving it. But we don't want to be judged by economic indicators. So what do we need? Firstly, new indicators to measure our progress, to measure our progress as middle-income countries, and what we can contribute, what we need to receive. And these new arrangements need to be reflected in the new roadmap, which is getting more complicated every time. And this is Agenda 2030, because the world has changed so much between 2015 and today. So Agenda 2030 is going to be the most difficult roadmap yet. It's not that we won't achieve it, but the whole context is more volatile. There's trade tension. There's everything conspiring against us. And that's why we need these growing connections between countries such as ours, European, Latin America, Caribbean, so that we can have regional, sub-regional links, so that we can combat inequality, so that we can fight for financial and environmental stability. And we can also fight for an energy transition, whereby we can actually reduce the importance of fossil fuels. And we need to work together in a coordinated fashion. It's clear that that's vital. The governance of the economic international system is not equipped at the moment to deal with empowered cooperation. Look what's happening at the UN. So we think that this alliance between Latin America, the Caribbean, and Europe is vital. Europe is playing a very important role in what is happening between China and the US. Europe offers us an area to have a dialogue on what the rules will be for the market. In a digital era, Latin America is about to make a huge jump forward and wants to talk to Europe on what the rules will be, where we have shared but differentiated obligations and responsibilities, as we've made very clear. So our countries have built up capacity, but there's no doubt that we need this new framework of cooperation. And so how can we develop new instruments? And here I'd like to thank the European Commission. I'd like to thank Stefano and Yolita, because they have been seriously thinking about how we can interpret cooperation mechanisms, create new cooperation instruments, a new association logic, and how we can better measure progress using variable geometry, because there's not a one-size-fits-all approach for development, clearly. And with people moving from one category to another, and talking about graduation, gradually we are moving into different development stages on the basis of variable geometry. So we need new measurements, not just middle income. We need to be able to also look at issues affecting both regions. Social protection, for example. In Latin America today, the key issue people are talking about is pensions and intergenerational blindness on pensions. But in Europe, they're discussing this too. They are a little bit more advanced in this debate, but not much. So political dialogue at different levels between the North and the South, between the South and the South, triangular, multilateral, multi-stakeholder, private sector, public sector, academic sectors, all the stakeholders fully involved in looking at development from all angles. And inequality. It's economically inefficient. We need to recognize that. And we need to approach it, therefore, I would say, obviously based on the values that we share, on a lack of discrimination, on the basis of gender, ethnicity, or sexual proclivities. Because there's no doubt there is a risk. There's a risk of people moving backwards. There are governments, there are societies that are becoming increasingly conservative. In Europe, that's the case too. So what can our generation do? One, we don't want to move backwards. It's cost us a lot to get where we are, particularly as women. So we don't want to move backwards. We want to keep moving forwards. And we think, really, that's the point. How can we achieve that? How can we achieve new multilateral associations? We don't want to move backwards. What we want to do is have a new form of multilateralism, new alliances, where countries with all kinds of incomes deal with everybody as partners with an equal playing field, with an exchange of experience, and also working together in a context where I think that difficulties should be seen as opportunities. And we have to recognize that the impossible can be possible. And that, I think, means that we're moving down an unprecedented path where there are paths that are opening every day. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Alicia. Muchas gracias, Alicia. Ahora, Could I invite Director for OECD Development Center, Mario Pezzini, to tell us how easy it is to think new, do new, start new, and change the mindset.
Good morning, dear friends. After Stefano and Alicia, what can you add? Maybe what I can say is this. We are here to launch this report. Here you have the short version for those like you that don't have that much time. On the web, you can find the longer report. Now, what is this? A report, as I just said? I don't think so. I think this is transforming itself, becoming more and more a platform. In reality, I would say this has been a collective production of different actors that have been discussing, analyzing issues, and putting in front these facts that we have called development in transition, with an expression invented by Rita da Costa, which is here. So I want to thank, because in one way or the other, we are four musketeers that have signed this report: the European Commission, CEPAL, CAF, the Development Center of the OECD, but much more is there. There are the discussions with Lara and Enrique from Chile. There are the discussions with Andreas, now new friend from Oxfam. There are the discussions with Fori, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Argentina. Cuba, where we have been discussing at the last ministerial meeting of CEPAL, many of the things that you see reappearing here. So I would like to address just 3 points. The first is why we have developed this emphasis on development in transition. The second is what we intend to do. And the third is the next step. As for the why, you have heard, but let me summarize in my way. We had incredible efforts in the past in order to address extreme poverty with the MDGs, and in general a view of the world where international cooperation was more or less, let's help the extreme poor to pass the line of extreme poverty. And this was done by calculating how many poor there were, how was the distance and the gap to the line of extreme poverty, and then coming to a total that, if distributed between countries, would engage countries to provide 0.7 of their GDP in order to deal with extreme poverty. We know that these engagements are not being fully picked up, but still, the question is that the world, in meanwhile, has changed. Mainly for different international factors, but among other things, also for the cooperation efforts of the past. But today, extreme poverty remain the major objective. Is it the only one? As we have said here, Stefano, Alicia have recalled to us that development is like bicycling. If you stop pedaling, you fall down. So also the countries that apparently have reduced the extreme poverty, they are still facing a series of vicious circles, kind of bottleneck, or if you prefer, traps that prevent from continuing. And how do you address the traps? Is it just a matter of an amount of money that we can distribute to certain sector of the population? Obviously it's not. How do you legitimate the public sector that nowadays is not delivering what the new middle classes are asking, as you heard from Alicia, and as a consequence people send the children to private school, or they say, as in Latin America, the 55% of the population, that it makes sense not to pay taxes, and therefore the public sector will have even less money. How do you come out from the specialization in natural resources that is evident, is at the base of polarized society, and also at the base of a limited diversification and development of societies that do not do research and continue to reproduce rents, and elites that are established on those rents and capture, as Andrea always recalled to us. So if we want to address those problems, we need a different type of international cooperation, something that is capable to tell you what are the policies that can help, how they are done in Indonesia, how they are developed in Rwanda, how we can learn also from China or Europe how to address all those issues. In other terms, the world of cooperation have changed because the targets have changed, SDGs are there to recall to us every day, because we have public goods that are global in nature and everybody has to contribute to build them. And third, because we have new actors. China was not there when we discussed the MDGs in reality. We didn't realize the extreme change that China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa development, and many other developing countries have produced, and we call it now the emerging countries having done a shift in wealth. Everything has changed in reality. We cannot maintain and reproduce the same system of the past that was built on a different world with different objectives. But if that's the problem, therefore I come to my second point. How do we build the new model? Development in transition means how do we transition to sustainable development goals? How we move from a world that have different horizon, different nature, different equilibria, and different targets to the SDGs? How do we adjust international cooperation in this new context? You have heard some elements have already appeared in the discussion. For example, we need new indicators. It's obvious that GDP doesn't work. The Sarkozy Commission with Stiglitz, Sen, Fitoussi, have already said it several times. In OECD, we have developed well-being indicator. Other organizations have developed other indicators. So nowadays, we do have a tool to measure differently what is the situation in a country. Where is the problem? That when we are in public discussion, you hear people saying, yes, theoretically we have the tool, but it cannot be applied. How it cannot be applied? Obviously it can. And what we are doing with the European Commission, with Alicia, with our friends, is exactly in a facility on development in transition to see and to apply this indicator to Latin American countries. Or the second very important element is to say, yes, but if we want to address those traps, therefore, where are they? They are specific by country, they are specific by region. Should we analyze each individual specific policy concerning the code of tractors on the cleanness of beaches in Latin America to understand if we are doing well? Obviously not. We have tools that are the development strategy, the plan in Latin America. They exist in many countries. Can we build together a narrative on in each country where are the bottlenecks? And address those bottlenecks to see if we advance. Cooperation is great at the micro level to identify examples of different practices in which countries and institutions get together to address investments or to solve problems. But these are examples. Can we scale up and address the major issues that countries are living? And third, if we want to do that, if we want to have new indicator, if we want to discuss what are the real challenges of countries and not just example of good practices, if we want to do that, how do we build the project? How do we build the cooperation? In a world in which you think that the issue is extreme poverty and the tool is finance, distributing bills from an helicopter, in that world, you need only two actors. You need a donor and a recipient. And the least that they speak, the better it is. Because what you have to do is to measure if you got the objective or not, and you prefer not to have interferences. But in a world in which you have to decide, how do you change your source of energies? How do you exploit solar energy? How do you address a specific bottleneck in the social protection system where you have economies with a lot of informal workers? How do you address the problem of infrastructure and to have them in quality terms? In that world, It's not enough to have two actors that don't speak to each other. What you need is to discuss and figure out what are the best policy practices, and obviously not in general, specifically to the country you are considering. If that's what you want to do, you cannot have one actor or two. You need to have the different actors that build the policy in every country. They are the civil society, they are the unions, they are the private sector, they are the public sector, but also what you need is to look at other experiences. Every minister produces a lot of CO2 today, because as soon as they are elected, they take a plane and they go to visit other countries to see if the experience that their colleague in other countries does work or not. Can we organize that? Can we have a dialogue between countries so that the policy are done in the appropriate way that correspond to the need? So these are just 3 examples that demonstrate that we have a new model to build, and we have some tools that we are experimenting. The facility that the European Commission developed on Latin America is exactly that. How can we build the software through which then future cooperation or wider cooperation can be implemented? It's obvious that with an important amount of money, but limited, we are not addressing the problem of Latin America. We are addressing the way in which it could be done on a wider scale. So what are the next steps that we have to face today? Obviously, the tool that we have analyzed needs to be formalized somehow, and we need to complete the work, indicators, building national strategies, modifying the modalities of cooperation are just some aspects of the story. There are others. But then we need, with individual country, to define what needs to be done in that specific country. What for Chile? What for Uruguay and Andrea? What for Argentina? What for Cuba? These are the issues that we have to address now. And more in general, if we want to redefine multilateralism, because that's at the end of the story what we are discussing here, well, obviously it cannot be thought only for Latin America. It has to be addressed in Southeast Asia, where the large majority of countries is middle-income countries. It has to deal with the transformation today in Vietnam, that they are asking themselves how to solve a series of problems of social protection, for example. If not, the reform of market will not keep the pace. It needs to be discussed with Africa. There is no doubt. Today, Tunisia has a rate of tax on GDP which is 31%, at the level of Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay. South Africa has 29%. Morocco has 26%, more than Chile, that is on 24%, which means that we can learn how to do fiscal reform from many other parts of the developing world, and not only from one. These are the challenges that we are in front. So, summarizing, I would say, we have done up to now a work that we have tried to translate in this report. Is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It's the end of the beginning. And now we have to continue these general efforts, because in a world in which we are not capable to invent an appropriate multilateralism, the perspectives are obviously dark. Thank you.
Allora, tenemos luz.
Now we have light to guide us. We have the work program. But what we would like to do now is listen to another voice of reason. In our daily life, we have certain rules, and I've got a rule that I'd like to share with you. The success of any meeting depends on the presence of ambassadors. And if you have one ambassador, then your meeting will be a success. We've got more than one. Thank you very much. But today we have a star amongst us on this panel who comes from a country that's very close by, and which has always been involved in this, has been undergoing fascinating change, which always seeks non-traditional solutions and is successful. We are delighted to have with us Margarita Cedeno, the Vice President of the Dominican Republic. You have the floor, Madam. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It's true, when you said a star, I was looking around me to see who you were talking about. But thank you very much for welcoming me here. And I'm delighted to be able to share this podium with long-standing friends and colleagues in this fight against poverty and inequalities, and new actors too, who are becoming much more integrated in this initiative, so that Latin America and the Caribbean can enjoy this new paradigm of international cooperation for development. In this room, I can see, and I'm delighted to see, many familiar faces, and I'm delighted that so many of you have come along to participate. Today, I have to say that I feel very happy to be with you. I'd like to talk to you about this new concept of development in transition, because this is something that is very dear to the hearts of ECLAC, and we feel that it is a good interpretation of reality and of the needs, of the vulnerabilities that we're experiencing in the Caribbean and Latin America. For me, this concept was music to my ears. It really was a moment when light shone down from the sky. Development in transition in a world in which international cooperation also used to lead us towards the development trap, a trap. And many countries like mine, and that are represented here today, I've got many friends from other Latin American countries, and I know some of them will be speaking in the next panel. All of us have graduated, if you like, to middle-income countries, and we now have the opportunity to participate in more international cooperation. Thanks to the work that's been done in our markets, thanks to the growth that we've experienced in our economies. In my case, in the Dominican Republic, we have a 6% growth this year, which is enviable, 6%. And we have been growing now for more than a decade. But that level of growth hasn't necessarily been accompanied by a reduction in the structural causes of poverty and inequality. It's not generating the necessary social cohesion either. And as has already been said, our mechanism for measuring progress is GDP. And it's turned out that GDP isn't the most reliable way of measuring our progress and seeing how we measure up to more developed countries. We then used to have a one-dimensional way of measuring our progress, and now we want to move towards a more multi-dimensional way of measuring progress. We hope that this will generate satisfaction amongst our citizens. We feel that this is what will generate the social cohesion that we so desperately need. And we hope that it will contribute to reducing inequalities in our societies, social inequalities, economic inequalities, which in the Dominican Republic, despite the growth that I've told you about, unfortunately, has been growing. We have seen a growth in inequalities, and if we look back to 2011, 2015, we are seeing 0.47, which is closer to the, which is causing concern amongst the leaders in the country. So when we're talking about development and transition, this really is opening up a new window of opportunity for cooperation between the EU and the Caribbean and Latin America. We want to build greater equality, and we want to incorporate a gender perspective in that, because we cannot continue to exclude half of the population from the economic, social, and administrative and political opportunities that there are throughout the world. Elia Wollstonecraft said that, she said, I don't want women to remain behind men. I want to empower women. So I'd like to make her phrase my own. And I think thanks to this new cooperation, thanks to this gender perspective, we need to ensure that women are included in this initiative. We need to ensure that we have legal security, political security for our citizens. This is what we need in our Latin American societies. There's also the topic, the issue of graduation. I'm a coordinator of the political cabinet in government, and we work a lot with international organizations. I remember when we were working on our strategy for tackling poverty, we talked about graduation and the idea that we needed to graduate. We needed to ensure that people had proper social protection, for example. Graduation. It shocked me as a word, because you may be in a better position than me, but not all of us had necessarily done those studies. So graduating, it's a term which I found rather shocking, rather difficult. But now we have this new concept of gradation, which I think is more in line with what we want to achieve today in Latin America, precisely because development is a continuous process. It's not a linear process. There are ups and downs. There are different levels of development. We need to look at the different subsystems, at the different sectors, all of which contribute to development, progress, welfare, and the well-being of our citizens. There's a challenge, of course, in this development in transition. We need to consolidate what we've achieved so far. We've talked about food security, for example, in Latin America. FAO and the UN, they work on these things. And we also need to continue to strengthen our human capital through social protection programs, for example, and in particular through education, health, provision of high-quality public services. I'm not just talking about coverage, I'm also talking about high quality. And international cooperation can help us to achieve that. If we have a new alliance and a new vision, if we have a more holistic view, a more forward-looking view in our cooperation between the EU and the LAC. I talked about this transition from a one-dimensional measure to a multidimensional measure of progress. The Dominican Republic is working with the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and in Oxford, important work is being done on that. This is helping us to see with greater clarity, with at a greater level of detail. We can see that poverty is a monster with many different faces, many different heads, and we need to tackle each of those heads if we want to have a country without poverty. Poverty is multidimensional, and that's the major challenge that we face. The Agenda 2030 is a very good platform for us to achieve progress. The SDGs, everyone knows about those. We are moving forward, and we need to make sure that we're making progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. As my friend Alicia said, these issues are present and need to shape the partnership that we have between the European Union and the LAC. We are therefore in a very good position to achieve the SDGs. I'd like also to share with you a number of new challenges that we're facing and that we've been working on in the Dominican Republic. Yolita mentioned the capacity for innovation that we have in our country. Yes, all of my programs feature innovation. And we've worked very hard on this whole paradigm shift. It's more like the fourth industrial revolution. And this is going to have a massive impact in our country. It's going to lead to new kinds of jobs. New skills are going to be required to meet this new challenge of artificial intelligence, for example, and this new wave of technology in our countries. This is already a reality. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's something that is already with us, and we need to address it. And in the Dominican Republic, from the word go, from 2002, when I came into post, we've been working on ICTs as part of a system of social protection in the Dominican Republic. We're doing this through community technology centers. These are drivers for local development in every municipality and every region. This means that all generations, but in particular the younger generation, including women, it means that they can become part of the new world dominated by information and communication technologies. And it means that they can have the skills that they need. Through these centers, we offer wonderful programs in partnership with international organizations. Women online, children, for example, Make a Space is the name of another program that we run. And we are innovating by giving women, in particular, more skills. We're increasing social protection and solidarity, and we're trying to incorporate technology into all of these initiatives. This is something that we need to bear in mind, because the new generation of social protection programs cannot disregard the potential of ICTs. ICTs are going to dominate the world, after all. And all of this is part of the is something that we need to take into we need to also take into account demographic change in Latin America. We have a very young population, and we can take advantage of that in Latin America. It is going to be a challenge, though, because by 2050 we will have around 40% of the population who will be pensioners, and that's going to present us with a significant challenge. We need to ensure that our social security system is fit for purpose and can meet the needs of that aging population. I'd also also like to mention climate change here. That's very important. And this new paradigm for international cooperation also needs to include adaptive social protection, given the possible problems with climate change, with epidemics that might be caused as a result. Our world is increasingly interconnected, and it's warming, as we have already heard. So we need to be ready for that. So we're moving from aid to development in transition, and we need to work more on international cooperation and promote cooperation between equals, between partners. We have lots of differences. Our countries are very different, but we can all therefore contribute to each other's development through more horizontal international development, South-South cooperation, triangular cooperation. We can share the accumulated knowledge and experiences, and this can help all of us to move forward. All with the support of our regional organisation, ECLAC. Time is up, I'm being told, so I hope I can just run through my last few points. Let me conclude anyway. There's a lot to say, but let me just conclude by saying how important it is to have cooperation between actors in all the different sectors, in the private sector, NGOs, academics playing their role of carrying out research. We need to ensure that we have a permanent impact and ensure that we intervene to have better social protection. I'd like to conclude by thanking the EU for its contribution and support, not just for its funding, but for inspiring us and giving us an important model for development. It's supporting our institutions, and the Dominican Republic is already part of Eurosocial, which is a first step for gaining funding to help with Agenda 2030. I'd like to leave it at that, but perhaps I could just leave you with one final thought. If we're alone, we can get there more quickly, but together we will get further. Thank you.
Yes, partners are vital for this long process. And for a long time now, we have been working very closely with Mr. Lucas Jair, who's our next speaker.
Thanks, Madam Moderator. Unfortunately, due to the change of the schedule, I have to cut all my speech because I have to be in a meeting at 11 o'clock and to chair this meeting as President of the Committee. Today we have our plenary session. So I will be only short with two main messages. The first one is here we are discussing about how to reinvent finally in a concrete way the international cooperation to make this as an instrument of the Sustainable Development Agenda. What I want to say to this first point is that first of all we have to stop to talk the talk and it's time to walk the walk. And first, not from the Latin America, but for Europe. In this hour, as you all know, the Sherpa of the head of state and government of the 28 member states are negotiating the strategic agenda for the 5 years to come. And I hope that the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Agenda strategy will not remain as a big statement when we are going as United and European Union in the United Nations Forum, but will become the guideline of the next 5 years structure of European policy. Although I think, and I take the liberty to say it is very clear, that Europe will be not enough credible to partner with other parts of the world in this strategic agenda, because this is the agenda of the future. Second message in the bottle, I think that as some of the speaker has already underlined, we need to change the paradigm, not only by the indicator, not only by the policy, but also on the way to make alliances with the stakeholders. And let me say, as the President of the European Economic and Social Committee, so representing the House of the civil society, that we have to become much more consistent than that we are today in involving in structural cooperation the civil society actors or the non-state actors as they are defined in the Cotonou Agreement, and so on. For the moment, we are involving them at least at maximum as executive or implementing agency, and sometimes as part of consultative bodies. But we have to consider more and more these actors as partners of this sustainable development agenda for the future. Fundamentally because they can play four roles. First, as facilitator of the process. Second, as catalyst of resources, competence and alliance. Third, as innovator. Innovation will not come by the official, will come by the men and women that concretely in society, as employer, as entrepreneur, as leader of cooperatives, as leader of NGO, as agriculture, as educator, as trade unionists are faced every day to invent the future, invent solutions to the problem. So we need to have them as innovator, and last but not least, as builder of social cohesion in the time of society in transition. Last, I am strongly convinced that Europe will be sustainable or will not be at all. And I am also persuaded that Latin America and the world will be sustainable or will be not at all. And this sustainability can be built if we consider the enormous role of leverage and mobilization of other resources than the public funding of private sector, civil society at large, and local authorities. This is the way to go together. Thank you, and sorry to have been so brief, but my time is over. Thanks.
Thank you. We do have a challenge that is facing us, but the challenge isn't for me. The challenge is for people that are very important when it comes to providing very brief answers to the questions that have been asked. Brief, no longer than 1 minute. Please, answers to the points that have been raised so far. And if I could ask Angela Ospitha-Nichols to take the floor. She's the representative of a very beautiful country, Colombia, and the representative of the presidential agency. Just 1 minute. Angela, please. What would the message be for our common future? Thank you very much. I think that based on what we've heard so far, the answer is relatively clear. Latin America, my country, Colombia, is in the middle of a development transition process. But we are also average at development. We are 10 years away from achieving the 2030 agenda and its sustainable development goals. That's a very short period of time. And countries like ours, middle high-income countries, are actually vital if we're to achieve these goals. But if we're to do that, then we need the assistance of the European Union and this new vision of cooperation, where we act together as one team working for sustainable development.
Señora Aina Calvo,
Mrs. Aina Calvo, the chair of the Spanish International Cooperation Agency. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm not sure, but I think the point I'd like to make is, firstly, development in transition sounds to me like something from a grammar lesson. No, I am transiting, you are transiting, he is transiting. Well, hopefully we are transiting, and hopefully this isn't going to be a trap. Hopefully we will be able to move towards gradation while we graduate. And I think that we need to ensure that, for example, big data doesn't manipulate us as people. There's so much research, academics. Who's controlling the information? And will we be able to build up an index? I think we would need to work with the academic world to do that. And I think we need to make it clear as well that we're not in favor of euphemisms, and we do need to change, but be clear about what kind of changes we want. And we need to also be very clear about the fact that we've always worked with Latin America, and we worked with them really preempting Agenda 2030 because we did so with empathy, with respect, cooperating. And that's something that we need to continue doing, taking on board the viewpoints of our partners rather than looking at things in north, south, south, north terms. There's a lot of southerners in the north and vice versa. So I think that we need to be very broad-minded and to look at things from both points of view, working for better social protection, working for a better shared future. Thank you. Well, maybe next time we'll just go directly to this part because this is really impressive. Juan Parbolina from the Chilean International Cooperation Agency. Thank you, Jolita, and good morning, everybody. To tell the truth, here we are in Brussels in this exhibition centre, and that is a great pleasure for us to be here. Some of the panelists have already said that coming from graduated countries isn't something we were happy with. But we're very happy that the European Union has organised this meeting so that we can discuss this with you and we can see just how much the relationship between Latin America, the Caribbean and the European Union has advanced over time. Latin America was somewhat absent in the whole process years ago. But if you think about the populations we represent who are now involved in the development in transition process, then that's excellent. Yes, there is the grammar lesson point and the fact that we're talking in gerunds, but we have a whole series of goals that were the MDGs, that are now the SDGs, and that we have to achieve. And we are very clear on the fact that we have to move away from just using GDP as the only indicator whereby we're judged. We need new indices. And the European Union needs to take this on board. You're saying we need to work together. We very much understand your viewpoint, saying we're stronger together, saying that this is a process for achieving the SDGs. And it's true that we may not achieve all we want to achieve by 2030, which is worrying in itself. But if we work together, if we pool our efforts, we're more likely to be successful. And I think that is a possibility. I think the points raised by Alicia, by Mario, by the Vice President of the Dominican Republic were quite right in the points they made. But what's vital, as far as possible, and I think everybody would agree with this, is that not only that we need to agree on the very concept of development in transition, but we also need to agree on how we proceed towards development in a coordinated fashion with the European Union. In this this case, in a world where multilateralism is going through a serious crisis, where it's being questioned, and where the whole context is so complex. We don't know what's going to happen with the trade tensions we're all aware of. We don't know what's going to happen. COP25 is meeting in Chile in December. And we're trying to work towards 2050, but walking a very difficult path. So we very much appreciate the fact of being able to give our views in this forum and to contribute to the whole narrative and debate on development in transition.
Andrea Vignola, Direttore Ejecutiva della
Andrea Vignola, Executive Director of the Uruguay International Cooperation Agency.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to speak to you today. Let me start with what others were saying. It really is a pleasure to have this conversation with you. We've been coming to this event for the last 3 years. We've been talking to Chile and the entire Latin American region about this initiative. And we need a space for dialogue. So it is wonderful to see how ECLAC, the EU, and the OECD have organized this space for dialogue today. My country has graduated from ODA, and we are now seeking responses. We don't want to just stay waiting. And so we want to work with other Latin American countries to work out what all of this means. Why are we excluded from this world of international cooperation when actually people are promoting a multidimensional model for development? So what I can tell you today is that we are living day to day, and we need to consider some of the issues that we're facing in Uruguay. Civil society in Uruguay is becoming stronger, and we need it to have the capacity for advocacy, the capacity to question. And secondly, academics and the 2030 agenda. We're not going to be able to achieve the 2030 agenda without knowledge. We need research from academics to be able to achieve this. We've got 3.5 million inhabitants. We need support from outside for our students. When we're talking about gender violence, that's another issue. People are saying, what is that? Unfortunately, we've grown, and we're very happy to have grown, but nevertheless, we have some significant vulnerabilities. And in this sector, what I can say is that the EU is a strategic partner, a partner with whom we want to work. We want to work with the EU because we speak the same language. We are partners within the multilateral system, and we cannot advance unless we advance together. So having this space to discuss development and transition is vital. We would like to continue working together because all we want to do, I think all of us, is live in a better world with better opportunities for everyone. We're going to be listening to young people too, and we need to do that so that we involve them in our efforts to create sustainable development across the region. Many thanks.
Hugo Sobral,
from the EEAS, which is the Diplomatic Service of the European Union. Thank you, Jolita, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak before this panel. It's a great pleasure to be here and to give you the view of the EEAS, the EU Diplomatic Service. I very much welcome this discussion and the composition, the makeup of the panel, which has both Latin America and the Caribbean and the European Union working together. I think our two regions are at the vanguard of cooperation. It may not seem so at times, but it is true. In Central America, the European Union started its first steps in external relations, working on peacekeeping in Nicaragua. And we have been signing association agreements with Mexico and Chile in the 90s, so that was a first. And the first cooperation agreement between the European Union and another sub-region was signed between the EU and Latin America. I could continue with examples of how our relations have been in the vanguard in the past, but how can we ensure they're still in the vanguard in the future, in a changing world, in a world where we need to adapt. But not only do we need to adapt passively to what's happening on the world stage, but also be able to shape what is happening. And that's why in April we presented a communication of the European Union on relations between the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean. And that was an attempt to adapt to changes, but also to shape those changes. And we identified 4 priority areas for future relations that we've been working on, but that are still fundamental. One is partnership for democracy. Democracy, the question of values, rights, human rights, that's a central component of our relations with the whole region. Secondly, partnership for prosperity, focusing on interconnectivity, the digital agenda, the digital era, innovation, research. A third area is a partnership for resilience. Resilience is vital. The resilience of societies when faced with the kind of tensions that exist and threats that exist to the environment, for example. So resilience is vital for the future. And a final partnership, a partnership for global governance, a partnership for multilateralism, because our 2 regions are the 2 regions that would lose the most in a world that had no rules. And all of us have to act following a logic where we're talking about complementarity, shared values, shared goals. What happens in one region with democratic tension happens in another too. The 2 are reflected through immigration, for example. So we do have shared goals, a shared culture, and shared values, and we have to learn to harness the value added of our relationship. We have partners in other parts of the world. What's the value added of the relationship between the EU and Latin America? It's the values that underpin that relationship. It's the values that go hand in hand with our identity as communities of values. And then our relationship with you goes way beyond governments and executives. It's one that is brought to life by normal people, civil society. And we need to actually harness that opportunity for all it's worth. It's something that's worth a great deal. Our governments are moving forwards. The status quo isn't an option. If we don't move forwards, we move backwards. And what we want is to continue moving forwards, but together. Thank you.
¿Y cómo terminaremos?
And how are we to conclude? With a voice from the young leaders. And we're very lucky to have with us today Carlo Angeles, who comes from Peru and lives in Lima. He works in the metropolitan area there. You have the last word, sir. Well, thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to say is that I fully agree with all the points that have been made and about the importance of international cooperation, which is directed towards the transfer of knowledge. And the main point that I'd like to make is that we really do need to achieve the SDGs and Agenda 2030. There's a financial gap for achieving the SDGs, and it's $2.3 trillion. That's a huge amount of resources. There is a market at the moment. It's a government market, and it's 5 times that size. It's a market in public procurement, and that's where and this is particularly relevant. That's where international cooperation can be particularly relevant. In Latin America, we've seen significant economic, social, and institutional achievements, but now we have a new challenge, and this new challenge are the development traps. The traps which make it difficult for us to move from being a middle-income country to a high-income country. The development traps are productivity, institutional, social, and environmental. Institutional traps are important because in Latin America and all the countries of the region, we're seeing an emerging middle class. And that emerging middle class has higher expectations of public services. In addition, it has a demand, it wants stronger institutions. We're seeing a lot of lack of trust of public institutions in the region, and people are not very satisfied with their public services. This is because public services have not managed to keep up with the demand from civil society. This is where international cooperation can play a key role by transferring knowledge to us. I started with public procurement, and I wanted to say that since 2010, or in 2010, the EU established its policy on sustainable procurement. This is a policy that has met with significant success in the EU, and that's important for me and for my country, because in my country we're calling for a transition to sustainable public procurement. What do I mean by that? I mean that the state should take into account sustainable concerns in public procurement. Imagine if all of the suppliers to the state had to comply with sustainable objectives, if all suppliers signed a positive environmental pact. The purpose of the state is to generate well-being, and what more effective way of achieving that than through public procurement? It would also be a more efficient use of public resources. And I'd like to refer back to international cooperation here. The EU can play a key role in helping Peru to transition towards sustainable public procurement. And it can be successful. It can export that success from the EU to Peru. Peru can be a case study for success in the region. Thank you.
Very, very quickly, Yolita. There was one point that I forgot that I think I can say on behalf of everybody that took the floor. I just wanted to recall the fact that we're here thanks to a success story of social development. And I would like to express my thanks for that and make the point that many people have traveled for longer than 15 hours to take the floor for just 1 minute. But cooperation, equality, shared dialogue, forms of cooperation, the path that we're following in our relations with the European Union and Latin America are vital points, and we wanted to make that point here and now. Thank you, Jolita, for giving me the floor. Thank you very much, Anna, for making that point, and thank you all. We're at a historic point in time with a new path ahead of us, a new strategy. We are one family, one team working together. Thank you.